Providence Municipal Court had seen thousands of routine speeding cases, but Tuesday morning, December 12th, would stand out as the day Judge Frank Caprio met a man who once stood between the President of the United States and potential danger. When a sharply dressed African-American man entered the courtroom, his calm confidence and subtle vigilance immediately stood out. The way he instinctively positioned himself near the exit and scanned the surroundings reflected the habits of someone from federal law enforcement. That quiet alertness would soon lead to one of the most emotional and unforgettable moments in Judge Caprio's 40-year career, a story revealing that even those who serve their country at the highest level can face deep personal struggles in silence. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because we're getting closer to 600,000 subscribers, and most viewers still aren't subscribed yet. Welcome to Judge Stories. If this case changes how you view service, sacrifice, and what it truly means to protect loved ones, share your thoughts in the comments. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this former Secret Service agent's confession made Judge Caprio break his own courtroom routine for the first time in 4 decades. Here's something to think about. What would you sacrifice to save someone you love? Because what this man gave up for his son will touch your heart and restore your faith in humanity. Also, when you see someone who carries themselves with authority, do you ever wonder what unseen battles they fought? Keep that thought in mind, because this story redefines silent strength. It was a typical Tuesday morning in Providence Municipal Court. Judge Frank Caprio, now 80 years old, was presiding over a familiar stream of minor infractions: speeding tickets, parking disputes, and local complaints. The courtroom was filled with a mix of anxious drivers and hopeful citizens, many wishing for the judge's well-known compassion. But at 9:32 a.m., when David Thompson entered the room, the atmosphere subtly changed. He was a man in his early 50s, standing exactly 6 feet tall, with neatly graying hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades in disciplined service. His dark suit was crisp, his shoes polished, and his movements controlled and deliberate, traits of a professional trained in awareness and precision. Yet it wasn't his appearance alone that drew the judge's attention. It was the way his eyes tracked every entrance and exit, his hands relaxed but ready, and the quiet confidence that marked him as someone who had spent years ensuring the safety of others. Even the other defendants noticed him, whispering guesses about his background. "Looks like FBI," one murmured. "Probably a cop," another suggested. But David Thompson remained calm, sitting with quiet dignity and composure, while others fidgeted or whispered nervously. Court reporter Margaret Walsh, who had documented cases for 18 years, noted how composed this defendant seemed. In her experience, even those facing minor charges usually showed signs of tension. Thompson, however, displayed the stillness of someone trained for long hours of vigilance. When Bailiff Officer Martinez called, "State of Rhode Island versus David Michael Thompson, case number 2024 MV 9847, excessive speed in a school zone," the man rose with the precision of a soldier. His movement immediately caught Judge Caprio's attention. "Please state your name for the record," Judge Caprio said, following a routine he had practiced for decades. "David Michael Thompson, Your Honor," came the calm, confident reply. His voice carried authority, steady and clear with a slight Chicago accent. "Mr. Thompson," the judge continued, "you were cited for driving 45 miles per hour in a 25-mile school zone on November 28th at 2:47 p.m. How do you plead?" Without hesitation, David replied, "Guilty, Your Honor. I was speeding, and I take full responsibility." His directness surprised many who expected someone of his background to contest the ticket or hire an attorney. But Judge Caprio recognized that tone. It was the voice of accountability. "Can you explain the circumstances that led to this violation?" the judge asked. For the first time, David hesitated. A flicker of emotion passed across his face, not defiance, but quiet distress. "Your Honor, I was rushing to reach my son's school. I had received a call from the principal about an urgent matter that required me to get there immediately." The room grew silent as people sensed the seriousness behind his calm words. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his tone softening. What kind of situation required such urgency? David's jaw tightened as he replied, his voice controlled yet full of emotion. My son has been struggling with severe depression and anxiety. The principal called to tell me he had written what seemed to be a suicide note, and they were concerned for his safety. The courtroom fell completely silent. This was no longer a case about speeding. It was about a father racing to save his son's life. Judge Caprio met his gaze and saw the pain behind his composure, the look of a man who had faced danger, but was now fighting a more personal battle. Then David continued, Your Honor, I served on the presidential security detail for President Barack Obama from 2009 to 2015. The revelation stunned the courtroom. The same man who once protected the President of the United States was now standing there for a speeding charge born of desperation. The room filled with quiet awe as everyone grasped the gravity of the moment. Judge Caprio's expression softened with respect. When you say you served on President Obama's detail, what was your role? He asked. I was part of the counter-assault team for 6 years. Your Honor, David replied. I was tasked with neutralizing any potential threats to the president, whether during public events, travel, or while ensuring safety at the White House and other secure facilities. The courtroom filled with murmurs as people began pulling out their phones, likely searching through photos from Obama's presidency, curious to see if David Thompson appeared in the background. Judge Caprio seemed to take a moment to grasp the significance of having someone with such a distinguished service record standing before him. Mr. Thompson, are you still employed by the Secret Service? No, Your Honor. I retired from federal service in 2015. And what led to that decision, if I may ask? David paused, clearly deciding how much of his private life to disclose in a public courtroom. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of deep personal sacrifice. Your Honor, my son was diagnosed with severe clinical depression and anxiety disorder at the age of 12. The demands of my job, the travel, long hours, and confidentiality made it nearly impossible to be the father he needed. Judge Caprio immediately sensed the magnitude of this choice. David Thompson had given up one of the most respected positions in federal law enforcement to care for his struggling child. That must have been an incredibly difficult decision, the judge said, thoughtfully. Yes, Your Honor, David replied, but my son meant more to me than any career. I could protect the president, but I couldn't protect my own child from his illness. The only way to truly help him was to be there. Judge Caprio began to understand the depth of this man's commitment. Most Secret Service agents who served on presidential details transitioned into high-paying private security roles after retirement. But David had walked away from that path entirely, to be a full-time father. How has your son been since you left the service? David's calm expression faltered, revealing the years of emotional burden he carried. It's been difficult, Your Honor. Some years are better than others. He's had multiple hospitalizations, medication changes, and ongoing therapy. When I first left the service, my being home helped for a while, but depression doesn't relent. The courtroom grew still. Mr. Thompson, the judge continued gently, you mentioned speeding because of a suicide note. Can you tell me what happened that day? David drew a deep breath before answering. Your Honor, my son had been showing signs of improvement, attending school, participating in activities, even discussing college. But depression can mask itself. On November 28th, his English teacher found what appeared to be a goodbye letter. What did it say? David's voice trembled. He wrote that he was tired of being a burden, that he could never live up to being the son of someone who had served the president. He said everyone expected him to be as strong as me, but he felt weak and broken. The courtroom was silent, many visibly moved. Judge Caprio struggled to maintain composure. David continued softly. He also wrote that my leaving the Secret Service for him had only deepened his guilt. He thought everyone would be better off if he wasn't around anymore. The judge realized the cruel irony. David had sacrificed everything to save his son, yet that very act had become part of the boy's pain. When you received the call from the school, what went through your mind? Terror, Your Honor. I'd spent 6 years ready to take a bullet for President Obama, but nothing could prepare me for the thought of losing my son to his own mind. I drove as fast as I could. Every second mattered. By this point, the speeding violation that brought David to court was long forgotten. When you arrived, was your son safe? His composure broke. He explained that after 3 exhausting days in the hospital with his son, learning how much the treatment would cost, receiving that $195 ticket felt like the final blow. He didn't know how he could possibly afford it. Judge Caprio now understood that this case was about far more than a traffic violation. It was about a broken system that punished people for trying to save their loved ones and then punished them again for the financial consequences. What happened next was extraordinary. Judge Caprio stood up from his bench, something he rarely did, and walked directly toward David. Addressing him with compassion, he said, "In 40 years on this bench, I have never seen a case that shows both the best of human nature and the worst of our system." He told David that he saw a man who had served his country with honor, given up financial stability for his child, and was now being penalized for doing the right thing. David's eyes filled with emotion as the judge continued, recognizing the courage and selflessness behind his sacrifices. Judge Caprio then dismissed all charges, fines, and penalties related to the speeding violation. The courtroom erupted in applause, but the judge wasn't finished. He stated that the real issue was the moral failure of a society that forced dedicated parents like David to choose between financial survival and their children's well-being. He announced that he would personally write to the state's mental health department to request emergency assistance for the Thompson family. For the first time in a long while, David felt that someone in authority truly understood his struggle. The judge went further, promising to contact local mental health organizations to establish a fund for families in similar situations, parents who had sacrificed their careers to care for their children. He looked at David and said, "Leaving the Secret Service to care for your son doesn't make you a failure. It makes you a hero." His words filled the courtroom with emotion. He emphasized that David's decision embodied real fatherhood, choosing presence over prestige and love over ambition. Judge Caprio addressed the audience, reminding everyone that society often claims to value family and mental health while making it nearly impossible for parents to do both. David's speeding ticket should never have existed because his desperate drive was an act of love, not negligence. The room filled again with applause, this time joined by tears of respect. Many present saw this moment not only as an act of compassion, but as a call for systemic change. Before concluding, Judge Caprio promised David that his story would not end with the dismissal of a ticket. He vowed to make sure the public understood what real sacrifice looked like and that other struggling families knew they were not alone. Overcome with emotion, David broke down in tears, tears that reflected years of exhaustion. Fear and love finally met with understanding. In the days that followed, the judge's letter led to immediate results. The state mental health department approved emergency assistance covering 80% of his son's treatment. Community donations and local media attention helped cover the remaining costs. David was later offered a job with a mental health advocacy organization, allowing him to support his family while helping others facing similar challenges. Most importantly, his son's condition began to improve, his guilt lessened by the recognition that his father's sacrifice had inspired others. Judge Caprio's closing words summed up the moment perfectly. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they work extra shifts, give up high salaries, and fight quietly to keep their families together. In that courtroom, justice was more than legal. It was deeply human. David Thompson's son once wrote a letter to Judge Caprio that said, "You didn't just dismiss my dad's ticket. You helped save my life by showing me that his love for me was something to be proud of, not ashamed of." 6 months later, David returned to the courtroom, not as a defendant, but to share his son's progress and thank Judge Caprio for sparking the chain of support that changed their lives. Here's what this story reminds us. True heroism doesn't always come from grand gestures. Often it's found in quiet, steady acts of love and commitment. David showed that those who serve our nation, even at the highest levels, face the same struggles and emotions as any parent. And most importantly, he proved that the greatest protection we can offer isn't for presidents or public figures, but for our own children. If this story moved you or changed how you think about sacrifice and mental health, here's what you can do right now. First, hit that subscribe button. Because Judge Stories highlights moments that show compassion still has a place in our justice system. Second, share this video with someone who needs to know that asking for mental health help is a sign of courage, not weakness. And third, comment below. Do you think our society does enough to support families dealing with mental health challenges? When David prepared to leave the courtroom, several people approached him offering help. A local psychiatrist handed him her card, offering counseling at a reduced cost. A woman in the gallery introduced herself as a social worker and volunteered to help him navigate available support programs. But the most remarkable part came next, and I want to hear your thoughts about it in the comments. Within 2 weeks, Judge Caprio's letter to the state mental health department led to David's family being approved for emergency assistance, covering 80% of his son's treatment costs. A local news channel picked up the story, inspiring community donations to cover the rest. Soon after, a mental health advocacy group offered David a job as a family liaison specialist, work that allowed him to support his family while helping other parents in crisis. Most importantly, David's son began to recover. Knowing that his father's dedication had been recognized and supported by the community eased the guilt that had fueled his depression. In his letter to Judge Caprio, he wrote, "You didn't just dismiss my dad's ticket. You helped save my life by showing me that his love for me was something to be proud of, not guilty about." 6 months later, David stood once again in Judge Caprio's courtroom, not for judgment, but in gratitude. His story is proof that true heroism doesn't need headlines or fanfare. It's built on compassion, persistence, and love. If this story inspired you, remember, subscribe for more powerful moments from Judge Stories, share this message with someone who might need it, and tell us in the comments, are we doing enough to support families facing mental health struggles today?